All right.
Phew.
But I would rather you face the reality of the world we live in and adjust your sails. Culture is like wind. You can't stop it. You shouldn't spit in it. But if, like a good sailor, you will adjust your sails, you can harness the winds of culture to take your audience where they need to go. Yeah, straight to hell.
Yeah, and there you go. You know, that
leads to destruction.
That's what he's saying.
If people are more interested in being happy, then play to that. Jesus did.
No, yeah. Well, what I want to know is where did Jesus play to people being happy? That's one. As a matter of fact, Jesus lost the majority of his followers in John chapter 6 because he wouldn't play to their happiness. He wouldn't give them another miracle because he'd already given them the sign of the feeding of the 5,000. They came to him and were trying to take him by force to be their king. And what does Jesus do? He rebukes them. He says, I tell you, you are not seeking me because you saw the sign, but because you had your fill of the loaves. And basically, Jesus is saying, you got your bellies full, and I did a cool miracle for you, and that's what you want. And Jesus rebukes them for that.
Exactly. And I mean, wow. But listen to what Carl Trueman says. Now, that was the Andy Stanley portion of his book, the portion from Andy Stanley's book, Deep and Wide. Now that the quotation is ended, and now we're going to listen to what Carl Trueman has to say. Listen to what Carl Trueman has to say. I think it's pretty funny. To be sure, this is Carl Trueman speaking now. To be sure, as grateful as I am to the Reverend Stanley for the offer to pastor my children and for providing me with fascinating insights into the philosophical convictions my long-suffering wife, I cannot help but see this a remarkably naive piece of muddled thinking.
That is exactly what it is.
I love this guy. Carl Trueman, I've listened to him, Phil Johnson, Carl Trueman, and let's see, Mike Avendroth and James White all sat around the table and talked about the elephant room. That was just a great video. I wish we could have done a blog article or something on that, but that was fantastic. But this guy is such a writer. I mean, he's remarkable. But anyway, with so much promising material, where should we start the critique? Perhaps with the unintended irony of a man warning his readers about feeling superior while at the same time assuring them that he has better insight into the way their spouses and congregations think than they do.
Yeah. His whole...
I love it.
The whole thing of the whole piece there of what Stanley quoted is absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Contradictory. It's like he contradicts himself, you know? And here this guy points it out. Trueman points it out very well.
Yeah, listen to what he says here. He says, or with the odd way in which he berates his audience for making the mistake of assuming that other people are just like them rather than realizing they are actually just like Andy Stanley.
Yeah, everybody's like Andy. Andy makes the world go round.
Sorry to, as you would put it, burst your bubble, Andy. But the people I know are not on a happiness quest. I suspect they are not they are not that ambitious. They simply want to find a decent bottle of cognac, so that they might temporarily dull the pain of existence with a little touch of old world class. At least I've always assumed they are just like me. One might also look at the travesty of scriptural teaching it contains. The problem of the teachers of the law, for example, was not that they were spot on. It was that they were corrupt completely
wrong. Yeah, we pointed that out.
Yep. That is why Jesus spent such a lot of time berating them for their errors of interpretation. And as to Jesus playing to people's expectations of happiness, one wonders why he made such play of the havoc which following him would wreak on families, of the need to take up one's cross, and the expectation of persecution to come. As far as I know, not even Peter Tatchell was yet tired to argue that first century Palestine was full of sexual fetishists who found their happiness by being regularly subjected to acute suffering brought on by religious commitment. He is so true. Jesus commanded that we take up our cross and follow him. Jesus said, if you love anyone more than me, You cannot be my disciple.
Right.
Doesn't sound like Jesus was trying to make people happy to me, Steve.
No, it sure doesn't. And he pointed out that very, very astutely. And that's, the cost of discipleship in that whole section of the Gospels there is not even something that came to my mind. The first thing that came to my mind was the John 6 and the feeding of the 5,000, and how at the very end of John 6, it says many of his disciples left him and followed him no more. And it was all because of him rebuking them.
Well, Stephen, the reason why that came to your mind is because there's stuff like that all over the Bible.
Yes.
Stanley's absolutely wrong, and he's pointing to, as if Jesus' whole purpose in life is to make us happy, and as if he's just, he's just come to be our little genie in the bottle, and we can kind of live like the world and do what we want to do as long as we have Jesus in our pocket.
Right. It's just hard to believe that this is the same Andy Stanley that grew up under the preaching of his father. I wonder what his father thinks about this. Now, don't get me wrong, Charles Stanley was not always my favorite. Okay, to me he was a little. He preached about sin and hell. He did, but I'm wondering what Andy thought about this growing up, hearing this, and how he moved so far to the left of that.
Well, he's like the postmodern, Stephen. He's looking at the culture, and he's saying, okay, look at the culture. Look how things are moving. We've got to adapt to the culture. Rather than suffer for Christ, rather than speak the truth, that's not helping anyone. People hate that, so we have to kind of meet them where they're at.
Well, and that's his whole point. Like I said at the very beginning, he started Northpoint Church with the idea of making a church that people don't like to go to. It's a contradiction. Well, hey, we'll start a church for people who don't like going to church. Well, okay, that's not contradictory. That's not an oxymoron.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff, Steve, we could talk about Andy Stanley. There's so much stuff that has developed, over the last year, with the whole homosexual debacle that went on in his church.
Right.
And then the playing of the worldly music and this and him actually, I don't know if you listened to Fighting for the Faith a couple of weeks ago, where Roseboro had a piece by Andy Stanley where Andy Stanley thinks that we should remove the word Christian from our vocabulary because
it's offensive.
It's offensive, and it wasn't meant to. It wasn't meant to put a title on people. It was really a negative term. Just ridiculous. It's really and here's the bad thing, Stephen. Stanley's big, and because he's big, other pastors are going to follow him. And because he made that statement about Christian, taking the name Christian out of our vocabulary, now you got other pastors that are preaching almost the same thing. And Roseboro brought that out very well.
Yeah. Let's continue on with this article.
All right. Let's see. Okay, where did I leave off?
Stanley's pragmatism.
Wait a minute. Hold on. Religious commitment. Okay.
Oh.
I will concede that Stanley is certainly right in basic contention. People are not on a search for truth. The Apostle Paul articulated that well in Romans 1. Stanley is also correct that truth is irrelevant to people, or at least they think it is irrelevant to them. Compared to Paul, I was going to say Paul Stanley.
There you go. Let's bring the Kiss singer into this, Danny.
Compared to Paul, Stanley's statement on this issue is rather bland. Paul goes much further, declaring the truth, the message of the cross, to be intellectual foolishness to some and a moral offense to others. It is not, however, Stanley's blandness which is the real problem. It is the practical conclusion which he draws from this. For Paul, the offensiveness and irrelevance of the message of the cross demonstrated the fact that those who think in such ways are perishing.
He is so spot on.
I'm telling you. That's why I love this guy. Anything he writes, man, you should read. I'm dead serious.
I mean, you have to look at the irony of this. Stanley's saying Christianity is offensive. Yeah, that's exactly right. Paul says the preaching of the cross, in 1 Corinthians 1:18, the preaching of the cross is foolishness to who? Who is it foolish to? It's foolish to those who are perishing. Stanley is trying to cater to a crowd who is perishing. for the most part. Not everybody. I'm not saying that everybody goes to his church is lost, but for a big part of them, he is catering to those who think the cross is foolishness. That's why he has to take his church in this direction. If he doesn't take his church in this direction, he's going to lose or a good part of the people that he has.
Right. And let's get back to the article. The problem is with them and with their cultures, not with the cross.
Yes.
For Stanley, by way of contrast, it is the culture which is to set the agenda and to which the church must thus conform or die. Stanley's pragmatism and a matter of analogous to the soft relativism of certain evangelical postmoderns looks attractively plausible. Yet this is only because it operates within the framework of the likely possibilities determined by the polite pieties and tasteful transgressions of modern Middle America. Safe, in other words, because Stanley assumes Middle America is pretty much like him, and therefore unlikely to confront him or his church with anything too tasteless. After all, what's the worst that culture might throw at them? Homosexuality? That is being rendered through thoroughly respectable, even as I write. Abortion? Out of sight, out of mind. Nice, clean clinics, a powerful rhetoric built on claims about rape, incest, and victimhood, and a euphemistic vocabulary of women's health, terminations, and Planned Parenthood help make child killing just one more private and merciful medical procedure. So far, so Middle America. The final cause of personal Let me just back up. Just want to make sure I'm in my right place here.
So far, that's right.
Okay, but if Stanley had the imagination to set this pragmatism in Nazi Germany or in a country where female circumcision is de rigueur, someplace where middle-class American tastes and preferences do not apply, then the cost of such intellectual and moral laziness would immediately become apparent. If you cannot stop culture and should not spit in it, what happens when the culture tells you that happiness comes about by gassing Jews or lacerating young girls' genitalia? That is somebody's culture. No point trying to resist it, for that would risk irrelevance, empty pews, and an isolationist Phariseeism. And we couldn't have that, could we?
He makes such a wonderful point, because what he's doing, just in case you folks might have got lost in all the reading, what Carl Trueman is doing is he is taking Andy Stanley's philosophy to its logical conclusion. Basically, what he's saying is, Stanley is saying, well, we can no longer risk to offend the culture. We have to go with the culture. So what Trueman does is he goes back and he sets that in Nazi Germany. Hey, Hitler's happiness was gassing Jews. So who's to say that Hitler was wrong for doing that? You got these other countries in Africa that when, they want to abuse somebody, they like he said, what was it? Cutting young girl's genitalia or something like that. So he's basically carrying Stanley's conclusion or philosophy to its logical conclusion.
Exactly. Of course, one can already hear the pat responses of "it could never happen here," or "but that stuff is obviously wrong." Touching in its innocence and predictable in its complacency, such mewling would yet betray a shockingly shallow understanding of both human nature and history. No one in 1900 would have predicted that the most technologically and culturally advanced nation in Europe would elect a man like Hitler and be the center of previously unimaginable genocide. Interesting what national military defeat, adverse economic conditions, and concerted anti-Semitic propaganda can do to a nation, is it not? Still, let's bring it closer to home while staying on the contemporary social margins. What if a pair of 20-something siblings or a parent of adult child decide that their happiness lies in consensual incestuous relationships? Consensual incest is already being legally debated in the U.S. And if the history of sexual politics teach us anything, it is that what is today considered as antisocial fetish is tomorrow not only a civil right, but also protected by hate speech legislation. And let us not forget that a current professor of bioethics at Princeton University sees nothing wrong in principle with bestiality. Already in